Hello everybody, and welcome to my channel, The Era of Entirety. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the friends and family who found this channel, as well as a random viewer who stumbled upon it. I hope all of you can find some value in my content. I'll cut to the chase and say that this is a political channel, and I'm a leftist. Like most content creators, I wanted to contribute something worthwhile. It's also for personal development, to hold myself accountable. Some of you probably have questions about what I mean by leftism, being in limbo, or what this channel might offer, and I urge you to hold on to them until I finish. If you want to, you can comment them afterwards. Today I'll talk about what I exactly mean by that, but first I want to explain the general purpose of this channel, because I think that it ties directly to the title that brought us all here. I'll follow how this realization led me down this path, and I'm going to end it by turning this purpose on the online left itself, i.e. the figures in the audience. You see, the purpose of this channel is quite broad. I wanted to use my knowledge and education to explore the ideals of leftism, and propose systems, plans, and strategies to improve the movement. The kind of content that I'll work on is quite different from the work of pundits. Instead of focusing on my stance and devoting the bulk of the video towards arguing it, I'll just provide a summary of evidence and pivot towards the proposals. There's a couple of reasons why I found this worthwhile, and this video is going to briefly go over them. As things evolve, I'll revisit and re-enunciate these points. Oftentimes, ideals find their authenticity in the efforts that realize them. You see, ideals are commonly known as the conception of the perfect solution towards a problem. The efforts that realize them are strategies, physical and artificial systems, policies, and just your run-of-the-mill planning. Creating these things really places the foundational ideals that guide them under a microscope. Generally speaking, the more intelligent the plan, the more legitimate the ideal. It's a simple but powerful concept, and it's often overlooked. What I'm trying to get at is that these conscious efforts lend credibility towards the ideal. The painstaking process that goes into creating each and every part of a working system also stands to examine the feasibility of the underlying motivation. It's worth noting that plans and systems that serve nefarious purposes exist. Sometimes parts of systems are created just to keep the people within them unaware of its nature. This means that systems can also serve immoral ideals. The risk remains that I might create something that is based upon a fundamentally flawed ideal, or engineer a system that can be manipulated. A threshold doesn't need to be crossed for these plans to delve into those moral areas, however. And I wouldn't say that the underlying ideals of leftism fall within it. They may not be realistic in some cases, but I don't think that they're immoral. The risk still stands that a decent ideal can be contorted into a horrible monstrosity. They don't say the road to hell is paved with good intentions for no reason. If I end up encountering a fatal flaw or unavoidable consequence in my work, I'll make sure to go back to the drawing board or revisit the underlying ideal. I didn't create this channel to act as a subservient pundit. I made to put my work through the ringer, to make sure that it holds up to scrutiny. Now, let's circle back to the main point before we move on. When my work does pan out, I want it to flatter the positions that leftists take on each issue. Subsequently, when I talk about free healthcare, I'll propose a system that, when conveyed properly, shows a sophisticated alternative that is clear and understandable. The crucial aspect of conveying the framework correctly brings us to the second point, which I view as being interconnected to the first. Presenting these ideals along with their evidence and tying them into a sophisticated framework is better than just convincing voters that a problem exists. Voters are especially wary of progressive rhetoric due to the fear that replacing institutions and laws will negatively affect them. The result of this reality is an additional burden, on top of the burden of proof. It's what I like to call the burden of replacement. There are times when a political argument requires the progressive to highlight their proposals. In many cases, this requirement is used to force the hand of progressives to prove the superiority of an entrenched system over an underdeveloped one. Let's extend our healthcare example. We could encounter an instance when a congressional opponent challenges a progressive candidate. The challenge would be to propose their plan for replacing the current healthcare system with single-payer healthcare. Or it could be when a family member diabolically asks you if you have a plan to help workers unionize, to convince others that your beliefs are platitudes. In common discourse, the ambiguity of the left's agenda is used against them to uncover weaknesses in understanding. You all might be wondering, why can't a progressive do the same? Why can't they throw this right back in the opposition's face to uncover the weaknesses in their argument? Well, it wouldn't be as effective. Let's consider two options that the leftists can use. The first has to do with reversing the opposition strategy The second has to do with fulfilling the two burdens. Republicans and neoliberals don't consider problems on the same scale and magnitude of their left counterparts. They aren't required to fulfill the burden of proof as much as progressives, since they argue for limited government intervention. Conceding the existence of the problem would force them to act against their ideology of limited spending and low taxes. Without the first burden, which would require them to prove that a problem exists, the second burden, which would warrant a federally facilitated solution, would not be necessary. Therefore, this two-pronged assault that the opposition holds over leftists can't really be used to the same degree. The reason for this point was to illustrate that there is only one way to overcome this strategy, and it isn't by adopting it. It's by undermining it, and the opposition by extension. Leftists would have to go about it the honest way, by tackling each burden. Luckily for us, there are many wells of evidence to prove the existence of these issues. During the first phase, most of the difficulty is in the oratory and debate skills of the individuals involved. If the progressive is well informed, they can force the opposition into the second phase, which is where the real difficulty occurs. The second phase is one of the reasons that necessitates the purpose of this channel. By focusing on creating plans, systems, and policies, it would allow leftists to fulfill the burden of replacement. Now that I've discussed the utility of this channel's purpose, I want to move on to a rough sketch of what it might look like. As some of you have probably guessed, this is a channel focused on civics. I purposely omitted that information to allow my point to come across, without getting the yawns and eye rolls that come along with the mention of the word. I'll emphasize in future videos the foundations of the varying civics, but for now, let's let the record stand that when you tune into this channel, you'll be watching videos that propose civic projects that are created to solve an array of issues. Just making a rough guess, I would say that there would be a dozen or so series that I'd focus my efforts on. Some are going to require basic proposals and simple planning. Others will need some serious skill and head scratching. For example, my first series, which maximizes the potential of the online left, will be a blending of some plans, basic analysis, and a couple of accords towards the audience and creators. When I get to a good stopping point, I'll switch to another series that might require some system building and heavy analysis and background info. After the following series has a good foundation, I might revisit and build up on the previous system, or start a new one. I'll of course be dipping my toes into multiple pools of research during this whole process. On top of this research, I'm going to need to utilize knowledge from multiple fields, such as computer science, math, statistics, and political science, to propose what I deem as a well-rounded agenda. I wanted to hold up the scrutiny and bolster the leftist movement. This is where we approach the question of whether or not it is possible for one person to become competent in all these fields, let alone create something with them. I've told with this question for a long time, and I want to relay to all of you that I'm committed towards educating myself. Now that I've wrapped all that up, let's get back to the first series that I was talking about before. My first series will be dedicated to some proposals and basic analysis geared towards the online left. The progressive movement, just like all movements, can benefit from some proper planning. The goal of this series is to create a well-rounded movement. In the first video, we'll start with organizing the most well-known and accessible for figures, which happens to be on YouTube. In order to perfect the thrust, you gotta hone the spear. I'll go into deeper explanation as to why I chose this route in my next video, but for now, let's call it a day. I appreciate all of you for taking the time to watch this video. It certainly wasn't thrilling at times, I'll give you that. But if you enjoyed what you listened to, you should like and subscribe. Thanks everyone, I'll speak to you soon.